I never expected my quiet suburban life to turn into a battlefield, but looking back, I should have seen the signs. The warning shots had been there all along, hidden beneath the pristine lawns, the perfectly manicured hedges, and the endless stream of newsletters about community guidelines. It was not just about keeping the neighborhood beautiful, it was about control, and when people like Eleanor Thompson ran things, control was the only thing that mattered. It started like any other morning. I had just gotten back from a 3-week assignment out of state and was looking forward to a few days of peace before heading back to work. My job was not something I discussed with my neighbors. As far as they knew, I worked a boring desk job in some government office, just another white-collar worker blending into the rows of identical houses in Pinewood Gardens. In reality, I was an investigator for the Treasury Department, specializing in financial crimes, money laundering, fraud, and corporate corruption. My work required long hours, frequent travel, and a keen eye for deception. I had barely taken a sip of my morning coffee when the knock came. Not a polite, neighborly knock, but the sharp, urgent kind that immediately put me on edge. I sighed, set my mug down, and made my way to the door. When I opened it, I was greeted by the sight of Eleanor Thompson standing stiffly on my porch, her ever-present clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, as if she had just swallowed something bitter. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she said, though nothing about her tone suggested she actually wished me a good morning. "I am here on official Pinewood Gardens HOA business." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Living in Pinewood Gardens came with an unavoidable downside, an HOA that operated more like a small dictatorship. And at the center of it all was Eleanor, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She had ruled with an iron fist for years, ensuring that every mailbox was painted the exact approved shade of beige and that no one dared let their grass grow an inch too long. "What can I do for you, Eleanor?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She exhaled sharply through her nose, clearly irritated that I was not already falling in line. "That structure in your backyard," she said, pointing with a manicured finger. "Your barn. It violates Section 7.3 of our community guidelines on acceptable structures. It needs to be removed within 72 hours. I blinked. "My barn?" "Yes. The barn had stood on my property for 67 years, long before Pinewood Gardens had even existed. It had belonged to my grandfather, then my father, and now me. When developers had bought up the surrounding farmland and built this neighborhood, my property had been one of the few that remained untouched. The deed included a grandfather clause legally protecting the barn from any future HOA interference. "We have been through this before, Eleanor," I said calmly. "The barn is protected under the original property agreement." She flipped through the pages on her clipboard, pretending to check something she already knew. "The board has reconsidered. That clause only applied to the original owner, not to you when you purchased the property." That was a blatant lie. I had triple-checked the paperwork with my lawyer before buying the house. I have documentation proving otherwise. She smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "Well, paperwork can be wrong. The board has issued 3 formal warnings already." "That was news to me. I never received any warnings." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Perhaps you should check your mail more regularly. We cannot help if you are too busy with your job to read official notices." There was something in the way she said "job" that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Most of my neighbors had no idea what I actually did for a living, but Eleanor's words felt deliberate, like a quiet threat wrapped in polite condescension. "The barn stays," I said firmly. "I have legal documentation." She gave me a long, assessing look before finally saying, "We voted. You have 72 hours to demolish that structure, or the HOA will take action. We have been very patient." From across the street I noticed movement. Eleanor's husband, Victor, stood in their yard, hands in his pockets, watching the exchange. He was not like his wife. While Eleanor thrived on control, Victor always seemed detached, like he was merely going through the motions. Today, however, there was something different in his expression. He was not just watching, he was observing, calculating. "I will need to see these supposed warnings," I said. Eleanor's smile tightened further. "Check your files. The decision is final. 72 hours, Mr. Lawson." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back toward her house, her back ramrod straight. Victor remained where he was for a moment longer before following her inside. I was still watching them when Meredith Hayes appeared at the edge of her garden. My elderly neighbor had always been kind to me, often bringing over baked goods and chatting about neighborhood gossip. But today, there was no warmth in her eyes, only worry. "Be careful with that woman," she said in a hushed voice. "Last month, the Jacobsons refused to take down their basketball hoop. 2 days later, their car tires were slashed. No proof it was connected, of course. I frowned. That was the first I had heard of it. "Thanks for the warning," I said, my gaze drifting back toward the Thompson house. Inside, I immediately called my lawyer, Sam Williams. After explaining the situation, he sounded more concerned than I expected. "This is troubling, Jack," he said. "The grandfather clause is ironclad. There is no legal way they can force removal." "Then why the sudden push?" "Hard to say. Have you done anything recently to upset the HOA?" I thought back. Nothing unusual. I had been away on a case for the last 3 weeks. Just got back yesterday. "That is interesting timing," Sam noted. "Send me the supposed warnings if they turn up. Meanwhile, install security cameras around the barn. Document everything." After hanging up, I went through 3 weeks' worth of mail. No warnings from the HOA. Either Eleanor was lying or someone had removed them before I could see them. I spent the afternoon installing security cameras, positioning them to cover the barn and my front door. While mounting the last one, I happened to glance toward the Thompson house. Victor was standing at the upstairs window, watching me. When our eyes met, he did not look away. He just kept staring, his expression unreadable. Something was very, very wrong. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. By the time the sun had set, I had reviewed every piece of mail I had received in the last 3 weeks, and not a single one of Eleanor's so-called formal warnings was among them. Either she was lying, or someone had removed them before I could see them. Neither option sat well with me. The cameras I had installed earlier that afternoon were now fully operational, feeding a live stream to my phone. I checked the footage once, twice, 3 times, nothing unusual yet, but I had a feeling that would change soon. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of eerie stillness that felt unnatural. Pinewood Gardens had always been a little too perfect, but tonight it felt staged, like a set in a movie where everything looked right until you realized the danger lurking just behind the backdrop. Across the street, Eleanor's house was dark except for the faint glow of her living room window, but Victor was still there, standing in the upstairs window, watching my house the same way I had caught him earlier. He had been doing that all evening, barely moving. I closed the blinds and picked up my phone. Sam, my lawyer, answered after the second ring. "Any news?" "Nothing good," I said. "The warnings she mentioned do not exist, at least not in my possession. And my cameras? They are already picking up some weird activity." Sam sighed. "This is not the first time I have dealt with an HOA trying to strong-arm a homeowner, but something about this feels off. If they are messing with your mail, that is a federal offense. Do you want me to file an injunction?" "Not yet. I want to see how far they are willing to push." Sam hesitated. "Just be careful, Jack. These people thrive on intimidation." I hung up and checked the footage again. That was when I noticed it, a shadow moving near my fence line. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I zoomed in, I saw them. 2 figures, both dressed in dark clothing, moving along the perimeter of my property. They were careful, keeping low, avoiding the direct line of sight from the streetlights, but my cameras had caught them. I bolted for the back door, slipping into the shadows as I approached the barn. The cool night air bit against my skin, but I ignored it. Whoever was creeping around back here was either up to no good or had the worst possible timing to take a midnight stroll. I stayed low, moving silently along the edge of my property. The figures were near the far end of the barn now, one of them crouching by the fence, the other scanning the area like a lookout. I crept closer, keeping to the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I got within earshot. One of them was speaking in hushed tones. "It has to be here," a man muttered. "You sure about this?" Eleanor was clear, the other whispered back. "She said if we find it, we let her know immediately." "Find what?" I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the darkness. The 2 men jolted, their heads snapping toward me. For a split second, we all just stared at one another. Then they ran. I took off after them, my boots pounding against the dirt. They bolted toward the street, heading straight for a dark SUV idling just outside the neighborhood's perimeter. The driver's side door flew open, and they dove in just as the vehicle peeled off, tires screeching against the pavement. I barely caught a glimpse of the license plate before it disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath. What the hell had just happened? I turned back toward the barn, my mind racing. Eleanor had sent them. She had told them to find something, but what? I knew my property inside and out. There was nothing here for them to take. Unless there was something I did not know about. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "Nice night for a run, detective." I stared at the screen, my pulse spiking. Someone was watching me. I walked back to the house, locking every door behind me. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I woke up to another surprise. A letter slid under my door. Unlike the usual HOA notices, this one was handwritten. "Last warning. Remove the barn, or we remove it for you. No signature, no official HOA seal, just a threat, plain and simple. I took a picture and sent it to Sam. If they were this bold now, I could only imagine what came next. That afternoon I decided to pay a visit to the one person who might have answers, Victor Thompson. Crossing the street felt like stepping into enemy territory. The front yard was as pristine as ever, the hedges trimmed with military precision, the driveway spotless. I knocked twice, and within seconds Victor opened the door. His face was tired, his eyes darting toward the street, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. "We need to talk," I said. He hesitated, then stepped aside, letting me in. The inside of the house was as immaculate as the outside, but there was something else, too, something off. There were no family pictures, no personal decorations. It felt staged, like a house no one actually lived in. "What do you know about the barn?" I asked. Victor exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "More than I should." "How? Then tell me." He hesitated, then walked to a cabinet near the bookshelf, pulling out a single manila folder. He handed it to me, his hands trembling slightly. "I was never supposed to see this," he said quietly. "But I did, and now so have you." I opened the folder. Inside were property records, land surveys, and a document dated years before I had moved in. But one page in particular caught my eye. A transaction between a private buyer and a shell company, dated long before I had purchased my home. And there, in small typed letters at the bottom of the page, was the name of the buyer, Eleanor Thompson. My stomach dropped. She tried to buy my property? "She did more than try," Victor said. "She thought she had secured it. Then the sale fell through and the land went to you instead. Why is she so desperate to get it back?" Victor swallowed hard. "Because there is something buried beneath it?" A cold chill ran through me. But before I could ask more, a car pulled up outside. Eleanor. She stepped out, looking straight at the house. "You need to go," Victor said, his voice low. "If she sees you here, it will be worse for both of us." I shoved the folder into my jacket and slipped out the back door. I had come looking for answers. Instead, I had found a bigger mystery. And I had a feeling Eleanor was just getting started. The night was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt too perfect, too unnatural. After my conversation with Victor, I had spent the rest of the evening combing through the folder he had given me, trying to make sense of what I had just learned. Eleanor had tried to buy my property before I ever moved in. She thought she had secured it. Then, for some reason, the sale had fallen through, and I had unknowingly stepped into a fight I never even knew existed. But what was buried beneath my land that made it so valuable? Why was she willing to go to such extreme lengths to get it back? I had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain, Eleanor was not going to stop. The first sign of trouble came at 2 a.m. when frantic knocking jolted me out of an uneasy sleep. I grabbed my phone and checked the cameras. Meredith Hayes stood on my porch, her face pale and panicked. I threw on a jacket and opened the door. "They are burning it," she gasped. The words barely had time to register before I smelt it. Smoke, thick, acrid, unmistakable. My stomach dropped, and I bolted past her toward the backyard. The barn was on fire. Flames roared into the night sky, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Heat blasted against my skin as I ran, my mind scrambling for a way to stop it, but I already knew it was too late. The fire was too big, too intense. It had been set deliberately, fueled by accelerants. This was not an accident. This was arson. And then I saw them. 3 figures stood near the flames, their silhouettes flickering against the inferno. Even through the smoke and darkness, I recognized them instantly. Eleanor Thompson, Douglas Winters, her right-hand enforcer, and Wendy Foster, the HOA. But it was what Douglas held in his hands that made my blood run cold. A modified weed torch, its nozzle still glowing, red-hot. Rage and disbelief crashed through me all at once. They had not even tried to hide it. They were standing there, watching the barn burn, as if this was some kind of spectacle for them. "What have you done?" I shouted over the roar of the flames, storming toward them. Eleanor turned, her face illuminated by the firelight, and for the first time she was not hiding behind fake politeness or a carefully curated mask of civility. No, this was something else entirely. This was satisfaction. "Oh, look who is finally awake," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. My fists clenched. "You think you can get away with this? Arson is a felony. The police are on their way." "Are they?" Wendy mused, glancing at her watch. "That is strange. I called them 20 minutes ago about a fire that you started." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced. They were not just burning my barn, they were framing me. Behind me, Meredith shouted toward the street, "Fire department is coming. I called them." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "We should go," she murmured to the others. "Not so fast," I growled, stepping forward. Douglas took a menacing step toward me, still gripping the torch. His expression was one of a man who had done things like this before and never faced consequences. "You should have just followed the rules, detective," he sneered. That word made my stomach twist. "Detective, I had never told anyone in Pinewood Gardens about my real job. As far as my neighbors knew, I worked in office administration." "How do you know what I do?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Douglas smirked. "We know everything about you. The real question is, does your agency know about your little side business?" Side business? What the hell was he talking about? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the barn's roof groaned and collapsed inward, sending a massive shower of sparks into the air. The heat surged forward, forcing me to step back. I clenched my teeth, feeling utterly helpless as decades of history, my grandfather's tools, my father's workbench, my own records, turned to ash. "You will not get away with this," I said, my voice raw. Eleanor tilted her head, amused. "We already have, Mr. Lawson. Check your email. The HOA documented your repeated violations of fire codes. We tried to stop you from burning trash tonight, but by the time we arrived, it was too late. So sad." And with that, they turned and walked calmly toward the street, vanishing into the darkness, as if they had just wrapped up a casual neighborhood meeting instead of committing a crime. I wanted to chase after them, to make them answer for what they had done. But I knew I had to be smart. If they had gone this far, they were not above setting me up for something even worse. I needed proof. The fire department arrived minutes later, but there was nothing left to save. They managed to keep the flames from spreading to my house, but my barn was gone. Ashes and smoldering embers were all that remained. "Any idea how it started?" one of the firefighters asked, after they had contained the blaze. "Yes, 3 members of my HOA did this," I said, my voice like steel. "I have a witness." The firefighter nodded toward where Meredith stood, wrapped in a blanket, speaking to a police officer. I hurried over. "Meredith, tell them what you saw." She looked at me, her eyes wide, frightened. "I just saw the fire from my window and came to wake Jack. I did not see how it started." My jaw dropped. "But you said—" "I am sorry," she whispered. "I was confused. It was dark." She would not meet my eyes. The police officer closed his notebook. "Sir, we received reports from your HOA about previous warnings regarding fire hazards on your property." "Those are fake," I snapped. "They are setting me up." The officer exchanged glances with the fire chief. "We will investigate, but right now, there is no evidence supporting your claim. Do you have working smoke detectors in your home? The fire marshal will need to inspect." I was being treated like a suspect. "I want to file charges against Eleanor Thompson, Douglas Winters, and Wendy Foster for arson." "We will take your statement," the officer said, but his tone made it clear he was not convinced. As the emergency personnel worked, I noticed Victor standing at the edge of my property, hands in the pockets of his bathrobe. Unlike the others, he seemed genuinely troubled by the fire, his face lined with something I had not seen before. Guilt. When our eyes met, he quickly turned and walked away. By sunrise, the firefighters had cleared out, and my barn was nothing more than a pile of blackened rubble. I stood in rubber boots, sifting through debris, searching for anything salvageable. My hidden case files were gone. The locked cabinet that had held them had melted from the heat. "Jack," a soft voice spoke behind me. I turned to find Meredith, looking small and afraid in the morning light. "Why did you lie to the police?" I asked, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. She hesitated, then whispered, "They threatened my grandson." I stiffened. "Douglas came to my door right after I called you," she continued. "Said if I told anyone what I saw, they would make sure Tyler lost his scholarship." Tyler, her only grandchild, a brilliant kid on a full-ride scholarship to university. "How could they affect his scholarship?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor's brother sits on the university board," she said, tears in her eyes. "Please understand. I had no choice." I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "It is okay, Meredith. I do not blame you." But inside I was already planning my next move. Because this was not over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the fire, I stood in the middle of the wreckage, the smell of charred wood thick in the air. My barn, my grandfather's legacy, was nothing but smoldering remains. Everything I had stored inside tools, records, and most importantly my backup case files had been reduced to ash. But I was not beaten, If anything, I was more determined than ever to take down the people responsible. Eleanor thought she had won, that she had erased something valuable, but she had underestimated me. What she did not know is that I never kept only one set of records. As I sifted through the debris, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Check under it. I frowned. The message made no sense until I looked up and saw Victor Thompson standing at the edge of his driveway, watching me. He met my gaze for only a second, before turning and walking back inside his house. Check under what? Then I remembered. I grabbed a shovel from what remained of my tool shed and started digging near the back of the barn. The ground was still warm from the fire, but after a few minutes I hit something solid, a metal case partially melted but intact. I pried it open, and inside was a single USB drive wrapped in a fireproof sleeve. I had hidden it months ago as a just-in-case measure, but now it felt like fate. I took it inside, plugged it into my laptop, and opened the files. What I found made my blood run cold. The drive contained financial documents, transaction records, shell company filings, wire transfers, all linked to the HOA's bank accounts. But it was not just HOA fees being laundered through Pinewood Gardens. The numbers were too large, too structured. Millions of dollars were moving through various accounts, funneling into offshore holdings and companies tied to government contractors, technology firms, and defense research projects. They were not just stealing from homeowners. They were laundering money for something much bigger. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names, addresses, and business entities. Then I found a list of properties owned by shell companies connected to the HOA. My house was on that list. So were several others in the neighborhood, all of them located near military bases, research facilities, or government buildings. This was not just an embezzlement scheme. This was espionage, and at the center of it all was Eleanor Thompson. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. You are getting too close. Walk away. I felt my pulse, but they knew. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. I grabbed my jacket and walked across the street to Victor's house. I knocked twice. He opened the door quickly, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. Without a word, he stepped aside, letting me in. You knew, I said, keeping my voice steady. Victor let out a long breath and nodded. Yeah. How long? Long enough to realize I was in over my head. I stared at him, waiting. He ran a hand through his hair. Eleanor is not who she says she is. She never was. Then who is she? He hesitated, then walked over to a small safe in the corner of the room. He punched in a code, pulled out a thin file, and handed it to me. Inside was a passport, several old IDs, and a single black-and-white surveillance photo from years ago. The name on the documents was not Eleanor Thompson. Elena Vulov. A cold chill ran through me. A Russian intelligence officer, sir, Victor said quietly. She went dark in 2008. Everyone assumed she had disappeared or defected. Turns out she had other plans. I exhaled, processing the information. The HOA was a front. It gave her control, surveillance access, and the ability to dictate who lived in the neighborhood. But why? Victor gestured toward my laptop. You already know the answer. They are not just laundering money. They are collecting information. Fahu. He shook his head. That part I do not know. But I do know she has people inside the government, people feeding her information. That is how she knew about you. I gritted my teeth. That is why she burned my barn. Yes, you were getting too close. My mind raced. This was bigger than just my property. Pinewood Gardens was not just a neighborhood, it was a staging ground, a hub for something deeper, more dangerous. Eleanor had built an intelligence operation disguised as an HOA. They had access to homeowners' personal information, security systems, financial records, even their routines. And if they were buying property near government sites, it meant they were positioning themselves to intercept sensitive information. I needed proof. I needed to take this to someone I could trust. But before I could say another word, Victor's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face paled. They know you are here, he whispered. You need to leave. Now. I turned toward the window. A black SUV was rolling down the street, slow and deliberate. Go out the back, Victor said. I did not argue. I slipped out the back door and moved quickly through the yards, staying low, avoiding the streetlights. When I reached my house, I grabbed my laptop and my gun, shoving them into a backpack. Then, just as I was about to leave, my phone rang. Locked number. I answered. Jack, a familiar voice said. It was my boss at the Treasury Department. We have a problem. What kind of problem? I asked. my pulse pounding. Someone tried to access your personnel file, then they tried to access your case records. The system flagged it. They used credentials that were deactivated years ago. I felt a sinking dread settle in my stomach. "They are inside," I murmured. "Yes," my boss said, "and now they are coming for you." I took a breath. I had a choice to make. I could run, or I could fight. And after everything Eleanor had done, after everything she had taken from me, there was only one real option. I was going to burn her operation to the ground. For the first time since this started, I felt something dangerous and sharp settle inside me. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. The moment I ended the call with my boss, I knew I had no time to waste. Eleanor had built a network of control, corruption, and surveillance that ran deeper than I had ever imagined, and now she knew that I had the proof to dismantle it. They were coming for me, but I was not about to sit back and let it happen. I grabbed my laptop, the fireproof USB drive, and my gun, shoving them into my backpack. If I was going to take her down, I needed allies, and I needed them now. I jumped into my truck, peeling out of my driveway just as another black SUV turned onto my street. My heart pounded as I floored the gas, racing toward the one person I could trust, Meredith. If they had threatened her before, there was no telling what they would do now that I had exposed them. I pulled up to her house and ran to her door, knocking hard. It took only a few seconds before she answered, her face pale with fear. "They are coming for me," I said quickly, "and they might come for you too." She swallowed hard. "I know. They were here earlier. They did not say anything, but they parked outside for a long time." I clenched my jaw. It was worse than I thought. I needed to get her somewhere safe. But before I could say anything, my phone buzzed. Another unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "You should have walked away, Jack." Eleanor's voice was smooth, unbothered. "You're making this much harder than it needed to be." "You burned my barn," I growled. "You tried to destroy my life. And yet, here you are, still breathing," she said, almost amused. "I am giving you one last chance. Hand over everything you have and disappear. Walk away, and you will not end up like the others." "The others?" Her pause was deliberate. "The Jacobsons," she said finally. "Sarah Wilson, your real estate agent, Sarah Jenkins. Do you really think she moved away on her own?" A cold wave of fury crashed through me. "You killed them," I whispered. Eleanor sighed. "People who ask questions tend to get hurt. This is your only warning." She hung up. I turned to Meredith. "We need to go." We got into my truck and drove fast, sticking to back roads. I had one shot to expose this, and I needed someone with real authority. My boss had already warned me that someone inside the government was leaking information, which meant I could not go through official channels. I needed someone outside the system. That was when I thought of Kendra, a relatively new member of the HOA board who had always seemed uneasy about Eleanor's leadership. If anyone might be willing to turn, it was her. I found her at a local coffee shop, sitting in a corner booth, her eyes darting around nervously as I slid into the seat across from her. "You should not be here," she said immediately. "Neither should you," I countered, "but we both know what Eleanor is really doing." She shook her head. "I can't. I saw what they did to Mark." "Mark?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "My brother. He worked for Victor's accounting firm. He found discrepancies in their records. A week later he was dead. They ruled it an accident, but I know it wasn't." I exhaled sharply. This was bigger than I had even realized. "Kendra, I have the proof to take them down, but I need your help." She was silent for a long time, then finally nodded. "Okay." We left the coffee shop and drove to the only place I knew Eleanor would never expect us to go, the HOA office itself. If she was still keeping records, physical or digital, they would be there. It was risky, but I had no choice. We parked a block away, approaching the building cautiously. It was dark, but I knew better than to assume it was empty. I picked the lock on the side entrance and slipped inside, moving quickly toward Eleanor's office. Kendra worked fast, searching through files while I accessed the computer. I plugged in the USB and began transferring everything. Bank statements, shell company transactions, real estate deals. The more I found, the more sickening it became. They were not just laundering money, they were funneling funds to organizations tied to foreign intelligence networks. Then, outside, headlights swept across the windows. "They're here," Kendra whispered. I grabbed the USB, yanked it from the computer, and shoved it into my pocket. We moved quickly, slipping out through the back door just as the front entrance burst open. I heard Eleanor's voice barking orders, followed by the sound of heavy boots. They knew. "Run." Kendra led me to an alleyway, then into an abandoned building nearby. We crouched behind a stack of crates as we watched Eleanor's men swarm the street. My pulse pounded in my ears as I listened to them searching for us. "Find them now," Eleanor snapped. "They cannot leave this neighborhood alive." Kendra trembled beside me. "They're going to kill us," she whispered. "Not tonight," I said. I grabbed my phone and dialed my boss. "I have everything," I said the moment he answered. "Proof of money laundering, espionage, even direct links to offshore accounts." There was a pause. "Where are you?" But that was the question, wasn't it? Was he in on it too? If I gave away my location and he was compromised, I was dead. "You tell me," I said carefully. "How do I know I can trust you?" Silence. Then, finally, "Jack, I just sent you a location. Get there now." I checked my phone. It was a government safe house. I looked at Kendra. "Can you make it on your own?" She nodded. "Go." I ran, staying in the shadows. When I reached my truck, I drove like hell, heading straight for the safe house. The moment I pulled up, I was met by a team of federal agents. My boss stood among them. "Hand it over," he said. I hesitated. "Trust me, Jack." I pulled out the USB and handed it to him. Within hours, warrants were issued. The next morning, Eleanor was arrested, along with her entire board. The news exploded. A massive espionage and money laundering ring had been operating under the guise of a simple homeowners association. It was one of the largest domestic intelligence threats in years. As for me, I was cleared of all charges, reinstated, and given a commendation. But the real victory? Watching as Pinewood Gardens tore down every HOA sign, every rule book, every trace of Eleanor's reign. She thought she owned this neighborhood. She thought she owned me. But in the end, she lost everything. The dust had settled, but the echoes of what had happened in Pinewood Gardens would never fully fade. The once untouchable Eleanor Thompson had been arrested, her carefully crafted empire of fear and control reduced to nothing more than a case file in the hands of federal prosecutors. Her network had crumbled, her secret accounts frozen, her high-powered connections vanishing the moment the truth came to light. She had spent years playing the game, manipulating people, silencing those who questioned her, but in the end, she had underestimated the one thing she could never control. Me. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. The money laundering, the espionage, the targeted attacks on anyone who stood in her way. It was all laid bare in court. Former HOA board members turned against her in exchange for leniency. Douglas Winters, her enforcer, cracked first, spilling every detail of the operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Victor, despite his complicity, had provided enough information to avoid serious prison time. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict Eleanor on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and arson. The moment the judge handed down her sentence, she finally lost the mask. The cold composure she had always maintained cracked, and for the first time I saw what she really was. Just another criminal who thought she was untouchable. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood changed almost overnight. People who had once cowered under Eleanor's rule now spoke freely. The ridiculous fines, the strict regulations, the endless surveillance, all of it was gone. Homeowners celebrated by tearing down the HOA signs and throwing them into a bonfire in the center of the community park. The same park Eleanor had once tried to claim as her own personal project. I stood on the edge of the crowd, watching as the people of Pinewood Gardens reclaimed what had been stolen from them. Meredith approached me, a faint smile on her face. "We did it," she said softly. I nodded. No more threats, no more fear. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. "I think this belongs to you." I took it, my fingers closing around the familiar shape of my grandfather's old keychain. It had been in the barn before the fire. I looked up at her, questioning. "I found it in the wreckage," she said. "Figured you might want to keep it." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Thanks, Meredith." She gave me a knowing look before walking back into the crowd. A month later, I stood on the foundation where my barn had once stood, the blackened debris long since cleared away. Instead of rebuilding what was lost, I had decided on something different. A workshop open to the neighborhood, a place where people could come together, build something real, something lasting, a space for a community that no longer lived in fear. Pinewood Gardens had been built on control and corruption, but now it was something new, something free. And as I turned to watch the sunset over my land, I realized that victory had never tasted so sweet.